Your Monday morning might feel brutal, but at least your employer doesn't expect you dead by Friday. That wasn't guaranteed during the Industrial Revolution. For millions of workers, getting hired wasn't a career opportunity. It was a countdown timer. Factory floors chewed through human beings faster than machines could process cotton. Mines swallowed men whole and rarely bothered giving them back. Chemical plants poisoned workers so thoroughly their corpses still glowed 50 years after burial. The worst part? Companies tracked the death rates, they had spreadsheets, they just factored bodies into the cost of doing business because desperate people lined up outside the gates every morning. Every workplace protection we ignore during training videos was written in someone's blood, literally. Each rule represents a pile of corpses that got too embarrassing to ignore. These are the industrial jobs that killed faster than most wars. Children as young as 5 showed up for work every single day. Not for pocket money, not for job experience, to operate machinery that could kill them before their lunch break. By the 1830s, records show nearly half of factory workers in some industries were under 14 years old. These weren't after-school gigs. These kids worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in buildings specifically designed to exploit their tiny bodies. Breaker boys had one of the most miserable gigs in the coal industry. These children, some barely old enough to tie their shoes, sat hunched over conveyor belts, picking rocks from rushing streams of coal. The work shredded their hands. Fingers got caught, crushed, or simply worn down to bleeding stumps. The coal dust coated their lungs until they coughed black. Most developed serious respiratory problems by 12. The industrial version of career counseling was simple. Can you sit still and bleed for 14 hours? Welcome aboard. Textile mills created their own child-sized horror show. They called the youngest workers scavengers. Their job was to crawl underneath massive spinning machines while they were still running to collect loose cotton scraps. One wrong move meant getting yanked into the gears. Factory inspectors documented kids with scalped heads, crushed limbs, and mangled fingers as routine Tuesday paperwork. The machines didn't stop for accidents. Neither did the quotas. A child got pulled into the works before noon? His replacement started after lunch. Chimney sweeps might have had the worst deal of all. Master sweeps purchased orphans and poor children specifically because they were small enough to climb inside burning hot flues. These kids scraped sight from chimneys barely 8 inches wide while choking on ash and sometimes still hot embers. Their knees and elbows developed thick calluses from scraping against brick. But the real nightmare came later. Doctors identified chimney sweeps cancer, a scrotal cancer caused by soot embedding in the skin. It became so common among sweeps that it was considered a job requirement rather than a risk. The medieval version of employee health benefits was good luck with the tumors. The truly disturbing part? None of this was accidental. Factory owners knew children got mangled. They budgeted for it. Replacement workers were cheap, and parents were desperate enough to send more. One factory report from Manchester casually noted that minor injuries to child workers occurred daily and were considered normal operational costs. The industrial version of workplace safety training was try not to die before your shift ends, and definitely don't bleed on the product. These children grew into adults, if they survived. But escaping childhood didn't mean escaping the danger. The factories that chewed up kids were just as happy to destroy grown workers, and the machines waiting for them were even hungrier. Adult workers didn't have it any better. Congratulations on surviving childhood labor. Your reward was 14-hour shifts in textile mills so loud that permanent hearing loss counted as a job perk. The factory floor was a wall of noise, heat, and floating cotton lint thick enough to chew. Workers stood the entire shift because sitting meant slowing down, and slowing down meant finding a new job. The industrial version of ergonomic seating was, "Your legs haven't collapsed yet. Keep going." The machines had no safety guards. Why would they? Guards cost money. Workers cost almost nothing. Women who operated spinning machines faced a particular horror. Long hair caught in the gears got ripped straight from their scalps. Factory records from the 1840s documented dozens of scalpings per year as routine incidents. The paperwork basically read another scalping today, hired replacement, production on schedule. Mangling was even more common. Hands, fingers, and entire arms got crushed in unguarded equipment on a daily basis. One British factory inspector noted that he rarely visited a mill without seeing fresh bloodstains on the machinery. Workers who lost limbs received nothing. No compensation, no medical care, no job. They were simply replaced by the next desperate person waiting outside the gates. The industrial approach to workers' compensation was, if you can't work, you can't eat. Now get out. Then there was the invisible killer nobody talked about. Brown lung, officially called bisonosis, came from breathing cotton dust for years on end. The fibers accumulated in workers' lungs until breathing felt like sucking air through a wet sock. Symptoms started with a persistent cough and ended with lungs that felt like concrete. By the time you realized something was wrong, the damage was permanent and irreversible. Mill workers called it Monday fever because symptoms always flared worst after a single day away from the dust. Your body tried to recover on Sunday. Monday reminded it who was boss. The worst part about textile mills? At least you could see the danger coming. The spinning gears, the exposed belts, the deafening machines that wanted to eat you. You knew what might kill you. But some industrial jobs killed so quietly that workers never knew they were dying until their bodies started falling apart from the inside. The poison was invisible, the damage was irreversible, and the companies selling death called it progress. Some jobs didn't crush you or tear your limbs off. They dissolved you from the inside out, and that was somehow worse. The match industry was one of these quiet killers, and it specifically targeted young women. Walking into a match factory in the 1800s, you'd notice a sweet chemical smell hanging in the air. Almost pleasant. That smell was white phosphorus, and it was eating workers alive while they smiled. Match girls dipped wooden sticks into phosphorus paste all day long. The chemical absorbed through their skin, got swallowed when they licked their lips, and settled into their bones like an unwanted houseguest who was also murdering you. Here's the creepy part. Workers literally glowed in the dark. The phosphorus accumulated in their bodies until they gave off a faint greenish light after their shifts. People thought it was fascinating. Some women showed it off at parties. The industrial version of a fun party trick was slowly dying from radiation's evil cousin. The real horror was a condition called phossy jaw. Phosphorus attacked the jawbone first, rotting it from the inside like termites in wood. Symptoms started with toothaches and swelling that wouldn't quit. Then the bone turned green. Then it started glowing through the skin of their faces. Finally, the entire jaw would simply fall apart. Physicians documented cases where they could reach into patients' mouths and pull out chunks of dead bone with their bare fingers. Women kept working until their faces literally collapsed because rent was due, and dying slowly paid better than starving quickly. The 1888 Match Girls' strike finally forced the public to pay attention. Over 1,400 women walked out of the Bryant and May factory in London, exposing conditions the company had hidden for years. Records from the strike revealed that management knew exactly what phosphorus did. They just didn't care because match girls were replaceable and lawsuits didn't exist yet. Hatters faced a different invisible enemy with the same basic plot. Mercury nitrate was used to cure felt, and hat makers breathed those fumes for hours every single day. Mercury is a neurotoxin. It destroys your nervous system slowly, permanently, and thoroughly. Within a few years of starting work, most hatters developed tremors so severe they couldn't hold a cup without spilling. Their speech slurred. Their moods swung wildly between rage and sobbing depression. Many went completely documentably insane. The phrase "mad as a hatter" wasn't whimsy. It was a medical diagnosis with a body count. Doctors knew exactly what caused it. The hat industry knew too. They kept production running anyway because mercury made the best felt, and hatters were cheaper than finding alternatives. One study found that the average hatter showed significant neurological symptoms within 5 years of starting work. The industrial version of employee wellness was, if you can still hold a needle, you can still work. Now stop twitching and finish that hat. Both industries shared a common thread that runs through this entire story. The companies knew. They had the medical reports sitting in filing cabinets. They watched workers die and kept the assembly lines running because profits mattered more than people. But phosphorus and mercury were almost merciful compared to what came next. One company found a miracle element and marketed it as healthy. It was neither. Imagine walking into a bright, cheerful factory filled with young women laughing and chatting while they work. The job paid well. The conditions seemed pleasant. The work itself was almost artistic. You got to paint tiny numbers on watch dials with special glowing paint. It was considered glamorous. Women bragged about landing positions at the U.S. Radium Corporation in New Jersey during the 1910s and 1920s. They had absolutely no idea they were painting with liquid death. The technique was called lip, dip, paint. Workers licked their brushes to get a fine point, dipped them in radium paint, applied it to the dial, and repeated. Dozens of times per hour, hundreds of times per day, thousands of times per week. The company told workers the radium was completely safe. Better than safe, they claimed it was healthy. Managers said the glowing substance would give women rosy cheeks and a healthy glow. The industrial version of workplace wellness programs was swallowing radioactive poison because your boss said it was basically vitamins. The glow became a novelty and a selling point for the job. Workers painted their nails with radium to surprise boyfriends on dates. They dabbed it on their teeth for glowing smiles at dances. Some painted it on their faces for fun. The company actively encouraged this because it proved the product was harmless. Except radium was slowly destroying every cell it touched, while everyone smiled in the dark. Symptoms started with toothaches that wouldn't go away no matter what you did. Then teeth started falling out for no apparent reason. Then entire jawbones crumbled and collapsed like wet sandcastles. The radium had settled into their bones, attacking the tissue from within. Workers developed holes in their skulls you could see through. Their legs snapped during normal activities because their bones had turned brittle as stale crackers. One woman's entire lower jaw detached and fell off during a routine dental examination. The U.S. Radium Corporation knew the whole time. Internal documents later revealed that company scientists understood radium's dangers completely and took careful precautions to protect themselves while telling workers everything was fine. When women started dying in obvious patterns, the company hired doctors to diagnose them with syphilis instead. They figured dead women couldn't sue, and blaming victims for a shameful disease would keep grieving families quiet and embarrassed. They figured wrong. A group of dying workers sued in 1927, and the trial ripped everything into the open. Records from the case showed the company had poisoned workers deliberately and systematically while lying about safety. The Radium Girls, as newspapers called them, changed workplace safety law forever. Their lawsuit established that companies could actually be held responsible for killing their employees. Revolutionary concept. The final haunting detail that still gives people nightmares? Women who died from radium poisoning remained radioactive for decades. When researchers exhumed some of their bodies in the 1980s, the bones still glowed in the dark. Their corpses were still giving off measurable radiation more than 50 years after burial. The industrial version of a lasting legacy was your skeleton becoming a safety hazard for future archaeologists. Radium killed dozens of workers slowly and painfully. But the next set of industries made those numbers look quaint. They killed thousands every single year, and they did it fast. Time to go underground. Picture yourself descending into a coal mine in 1900. The elevator cage drops you hundreds of feet below the Earth's surface into darkness so complete it feels solid. The air gets hotter with every foot, thicker, harder to breathe. The only light comes from the flickering flame on your helmet. That flame is simultaneously your only way to see and your potential death warrant. If the mine didn't collapse on you, it exploded. If it didn't explode, it suffocated you slowly over 20 years. Welcome to the deadliest regular job in industrial America. Methane gas seeped naturally from coal seams, building up in invisible pockets throughout the tunnels like nature's booby traps. One spark from a pick-striking rock wrong, one miner's lamp flickering at the wrong angle, and the entire shaft became a fireball. The Monongah mining disaster in West Virginia killed 362 men in December 1907. It remains the deadliest mining accident in American history. Most bodies were never recovered because the tunnels were too dangerous to search. They're still down there. The industrial version of mine safety equipment was a canary in a cage. Seriously, that was the protocol. Miners carried birds underground because canaries died faster from gas exposure than humans did. If your canary suddenly dropped dead, you had maybe 60 seconds to run before you joined it. That was the entire safety system. Watch the bird. If the bird dies, hopefully you're faster than poison gas. The medieval version of OSHA was basically a parakeet. Collapses were equally terrifying and far more random. Support timbers rotted or simply gave way without any warning, bringing thousands of tons of rock down on workers in an instant. Men trapped by cave-ins faced slow death by suffocation, dehydration, or crushing injuries that took days to kill them. Rescue attempts rarely succeeded and often killed the rescuers too. Mining companies ran the numbers and calculated that it cost less to hire replacement workers than to invest in proper reinforcement. Records show that by 1900, roughly 2,000 American miners died every year. The companies filed this under acceptable operational costs. Even if you somehow avoided explosions and collapses through sheer luck, the coal dust was killing you anyway on a slower schedule. Black lung disease, officially called pneumoconiosis, turned miners' lungs into something resembling tight 8-8 chalk. Coal particles accumulated with every single breath, scarring the tissue until breathing became a constant, painful struggle. Most long-term miners developed the condition. There was no treatment. You just coughed and wheezed and suffocated incrementally until your lungs finally gave out entirely. Children worked these mines too, because of course they did. Breaker boys as young as 8 sorted coal in the processing facilities, but plenty of kids went underground alongside adults because they fit into smaller tunnels. The company towns made escape impossible even if you wanted out. Miners were paid in scrip, a fake currency only accepted at company-owned stores where prices were hilariously inflated. Workers ended up owing money to the company they worked for, trapped in debt they could mathematically never pay off. The industrial version of freedom was choosing which method of death suited your schedule. Underground was hell, but the industries building America's surface were grinding through workers just as fast, and their body counts were somehow even higher. Building the railroad killed more men than some actual wars. This isn't dramatic exaggeration. Between 1889 and 1906, records show that roughly 72,000 railroad workers were killed on the job. Another 2 million were seriously injured. The industry that connected America from coast to coast did it by grinding through human beings like they were raw materials with expiration dates. The most dangerous job on the rails was coupling cars together. Before automatic couplers existed, workers had to stand between two moving train cars and manually drop a metal pin into a slot to link them. The timing had to be absolutely perfect. Too slow, and the cars would crush you flat. Too fast, and your arm got caught and mangled. Brakemen lost fingers and hands so regularly that missing digits became an unofficial badge of the profession. Veteran rail workers could identify each other by counting stumps. The industrial version of job qualifications was, can you still hold the pin with whatever fingers you have left? Brakemen who worked the tops of trains somehow had it even worse. Their job required sprinting across moving freight cars, leaping between gaps, and manually turning brake wheels regardless of weather conditions. Ice storms, high winds, low-clearance bridges that could decapitate you. One slip meant falling under the wheels or tumbling to death on the tracks below. Railroad companies didn't slow operations for bad weather. The schedule mattered more than the men running on top of it. The industrial version of workplace flexibility was adapt or die, preferably off company property. Tunnel construction was its own special circle of hell carved into mountainsides. Workers blasted through solid rock using dynamite, inhaling silica dust that destroyed their lungs almost as efficiently as the cave-ins destroyed everyone else. Silicosis killed tunnel workers in job lots. Chinese laborers, brought in specifically because they worked for lower wages and complained less, got assigned the most dangerous tasks available. They handled the explosives, worked the most unstable sections, and died in numbers that were never accurately counted because nobody considered them worth tracking. Steel mills offered a different kind of death lottery with better odds of dying creatively. Molten metal at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit poured constantly through these facilities like Satan's lemonade stand. One splash could burn through flesh to bone instantly. Workers operated in environments so hot that shift lengths were limited not by labor laws, but by how long a human body could function before collapsing from heat exhaustion. Falling into a ladle of molten steel meant vaporizing before you could scream. The industrial version of workplace accidents sometimes left nothing to bury or identify. Falls killed almost as many steel workers as the molten metal itself. Men assembled frameworks hundreds of feet in the air with no safety harnesses, no nets, and no margin for error. You climbed, you balanced, you hoped. 12-hour shifts meant fatigue-related accidents were statistically inevitable. By the early 1900s, Pittsburgh steel mills were killing roughly 300 workers every single year. The companies kept production targets unchanged. Slaughterhouses completed the industrial death trifecta with their own special horrors. The speed of the killing floors meant workers made hundreds of cuts per hour with razor-sharp knives in slippery conditions covered in blood and fat. Injuries happened constantly. Infections followed. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle exposed conditions so horrific that it changed food safety law in America. though Sinclair himself noted bitterly that readers cared far more about what went into their sausages than what happened to the workers making them. The industrial version of public outrage was, "Please don't put rat parts in my breakfast." These jobs killed fast and killed visibly, but what about the workers who somehow survived? Their stories might actually be worse. Surviving wasn't the same as winning, not even close. If you made it through the factory floor without losing a limb, the mine without getting buried alive, or the rail yard without getting crushed between cars, you still faced a system specifically designed to throw you away the moment you couldn't produce anymore. There was no workers' compensation. Getting injured on the job meant getting fired from the job, usually before the blood dried. Companies had no legal obligation to pay for medical care, lost wages, or anything else. Workers who complained got blacklisted. Their names circulated among employers like a do-not-hire criminal database, so nobody in the industry would touch them. The industrial version of employee benefits was, "Here's the door. Try not to bleed on it and don't expect a reference." Company doctors made everything actively worse. These physicians worked for the factory, not the patient, and their actual job was denying that injuries had anything to do with work. Lung disease from 20 years of coal dust? Must be tuberculosis from your dirty immigrant home. Poisoning from chemicals you handled daily? Probably something you ate last week. Investigations decades later revealed that company doctors routinely falsified causes of death, specifically to protect employers from liability claims that technically didn't even exist yet. The industrial version of medical care was diagnosing your death as your own fault. Families paid the real price for industrial killing. When workers died or became too disabled to continue, widows and orphans got nothing. No pension, no insurance, no safety net. Children who escaped factory work to attend school found themselves right back in the mills when their fathers got killed or crippled. The cycle continued generation after generation because there was no alternative and no way out. Some workers tried to fight back through early labor unions that organized strikes, demanding safer conditions and better pay. Companies responded with violence so extreme it made the factories look gentle. They hired private security forces and actual armed militias to break strikes, sometimes literally breaking the strikers in the process. The Homestead Strike of 1892 left 10 people dead in open combat. The Ludlow Massacre in 1914 killed roughly 24 people, including women and children living in a tent colony of striking miners. The industrial approach to labor negotiations was agree to our terms or we'll murder your family. It took disasters too public to ignore before anything changed. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City on March 25, 1911, killed 146 workers, mostly young immigrant women. The exit doors had been locked from outside to prevent unauthorized bathroom breaks. Workers jumped from 8th-floor windows to escape the flames, dying on impact in front of massive, horrified crowds. Fire escapes collapsed under the weight of fleeing workers. The youngest victim was 14 years old. The oldest was 43. Most were teenagers. The public outrage that followed finally forced actual reform. New York passed dozens of workplace safety laws within 2 years of the fire. Other states followed slowly. The first meaningful child labor restrictions appeared, though enforcement remained weak for decades while companies found loopholes. Progress came, but it came measured in bodies stacked high enough to become politically inconvenient. Every regulation represented a fight someone died winning. It took mountains of bodies to build the safety regulations we take for granted today. The real question is whether we actually learned anything from stacking them. Every safety regulation you ignore during those boring training videos is written in someone's blood. That's not metaphor. That's not dramatic emphasis. Each specific rule exists because enough workers died in that exact way that ignoring the pile of bodies became politically impossible. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, didn't exist until 1970. That means American workers spent nearly 200 years of industrial development with essentially no federal protection whatsoever. Child labor wasn't meaningfully restricted until the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Workers' compensation systems only became widespread in the early 20th century, and only because lawsuits from mangled employees were starting to cost companies more than basic prevention would have. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of workers died annually during the peak of industrialization. The exact numbers are impossible to calculate because so many deaths simply weren't recorded. A dead miner in 1890 might appear in company logs as left employment. A poisoned factory worker might be listed as natural causes or personal illness. The real toll remains buried in unmarked graves, incomplete records, and family stories nobody wrote down. The protections we have today came directly from those bodies. Hard hats exist because workers' skulls kept getting crushed in predictable patterns. Fire exits must remain unlocked because 146 people burned to death behind locked doors in one afternoon. Safety guards on machinery became mandatory after enough arms got torn off to make newspaper front pages. The industrial version of safety standards was count the bodies, wait for outrage, make a rule, repeat. And the work still isn't finished. The same jobs that killed American workers a century ago still kill workers in developing countries today. The factories moved overseas. The danger stayed exactly the same. The death toll just shifted to places where news cameras don't point. So the next time your Monday morning feels brutal, the next time you're annoyed by a mandatory safety meeting or frustrated by your commute, remember what work used to mean. Remember the children sorting coal with bleeding fingers until their lungs turned black. The women whose jaws rotted off from poison their bosses said was healthy. The men who descended into mines every morning, knowing they might not come back up for dinner. Your job might be stressful. Your boss might be a nightmare. Your commute might slowly be destroying your will to live, but at least your employer doesn't budget for your death as a routine operational expense. That's progress. Progress paid for by everyone who came before you and didn't survive long enough to see it.